everyone that a new day was dawning. In addition to this one-part religious, one-part political purge, Licinius also engaged in a 100% political purge of any potential dynastic rivals. It goes without saying that Maximinus' memory was damned, and his family was rounded up and executed. But Licinius also tracked down the son of Severus, who had been serving with Maximinus, and had him killed as well. He also intended to dispose of Diocletian's wife and daughter, who were being held back in Nicomedia, but they managed to escape before the execution order came through. It would take 15 months of searching before the two women were finally tracked down and beheaded in a public execution. Killing women and children was not a nice thing to do, but clearly, Licinius had read his Machiavelli. Later in 313, Licinius and Constantine formalized their power-sharing agreement, with Constantine taking the west and Licinius the east, their territories divided roughly by the Adriatic. It would not take long before relations between the two men began to deteriorate. As I said last week, practically everything Constantine ever did points to him wanting from the get-go to be sole emperor. One emperor ruling one empire, serving one god. Now that Maxentius and Maximinus Daia were disposed of, Licinius was no longer a helpful partner in Constantine's quest for power, but was instead an obstacle in the way. Next week, the brothers-in-law will waste no time getting on each other's nerves, and Constantine will waste no time digging up a pretext for war. But before we go this week, I want to pass along a quick birthday message to devout listener Derek, who just turned 30 yesterday. Derek, happy birthday. Now, stop listening to this podcast and go take care of your lovely wife and newborn daughter. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. Also, you can keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to go with a recommendation from listener Paul, Imperium and Conspirata by Robert Harris, the first two books in a planned trilogy of historical fiction novels about the life and times of everyone's favorite genius windbag, Cicero. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 135, Brothers in Name Only. Following the defeat and death of Maximinus Daia in the summer of 313 AD, the Roman Empire was back down to two emperors for the first time in 20 years. But unlike the previous partnership between Diocletian and Maximian, the partnership between Constantine and Licinius was not premised on cooperation and mutual respect, so much as on hostility and mutual suspicion. Their joint reign was not about working together to solve the problems of the empire. It was instead about putting themselves in the best position possible to take the other out as soon as an opportunity presented itself. The two men resembled no one so much as Octavian and Antony. They were avowed allies, legally brothers-in-law, and ready to slit each other's throats at the drop of a hat. And of course, in the end, the climax of their drama played out the same as well, with the man in the West utterly crushing the man in the East. But, just like that old drama, this new drama would take more than a decade to play out. Licinius did not have long to savor his victory over Maximinus before the responsibilities he had won for himself came knocking. After arriving in Antioch to consolidate his rule over Syria, Licinius appears to have been dragged straight away into hostilities with Rome's Persian neighbor to the east. There is very little detail in the record about what exactly was going on between the Romans and the Sassanids at this point in history, but one thing was clear. Whatever fight Maximinus Daia had been embroiled in when Constantine knocked off Maxentius, it was far from over. But though we don't know the exact circumstances, if we take historical precedents and combine them with one major contemporaneous event, historians reckon that once again the two empires were feuding over Armenia. That one major contemporaneous event occurred in the late summer or early fall of 314 AD, maybe 6 to 9 months after Licinius began campaigning in the desert. A new king of Armenia was crowned. The establishment of a new monarch over the border kingdom at this particular moment is why historians suspect Rome and Persia were fighting over Armenia. But, that said, there is nothing particularly major about Armenia getting a new king. It happened all the time. What made it a major event is that the new king Tiridates had recently been baptized a Christian, and when he took over the throne, he declared that the kingdom of Armenia would henceforth recognize Christianity as its official religion. This, of course, was the first time in history that any government recognized Christianity as its state religion, which, I think you'll agree, is a major event indeed. While Licinius was thus absorbed in the east, Constantine handled all imperial business in the west. After satisfying himself that Maximinus was dead and that he would not have to, invade Illyria or something, Constantine headed back north to Gaul and established a headquarters at Trier. He spent most of the next year dealing with the routine matters of government, petitions here, skirmishes with the Germans there, etc., etc. But in the summer of 314, Constantine dealt with his own major turning point in the history of Christianity. This turning point sprang from an internal disagreement within the church, which led to one side appealing to the emperor to resolve the argument. For the first 300 years of Christianity's existence, the imperial government was not just a separate institution, it was practically the exact opposite of everything Christianity stood for. But now that Constantine was in power, that was all about to change. And it is the Donatists who get the credit, or the blame, depending on your point of view, for first inviting the emperor into the church. The stage for this invitation was set by the Great Persecution. Essentially what happened is that while the persecution was going on, the Christians wound up breaking down into two camps, those who complied with the imperial authorities and those who resisted. Now that the persecution was over, the Christian leadership was faced with the question of what to do with the collaborating clergymen, who were called traditores, or men who had handed over, which gives us the root of our English word, traitor. Could they just return as if nothing had happened, or did they need to be rebaptized, or what? And more importantly, should they be allowed to return at all? You'll recall that following the Decian persecution, the church faced a similar situation, and eventually came down solidly on the side of readmittance without the need for rebaptism, and declared the opposing view heretical. You'll also recall that when we discussed what became known as the Novatianist heresy, that I said it was a precursor to the much larger fight that would follow Diocletian's great persecution. Well, here we are. A faction within the church, centered in North Africa and led by, but not founded by, the Bishop Donatus, believed that collaborating members of the clergy should not be allowed to maintain their positions, and that any sacraments they celebrated should be considered invalid. The position of these so-called Donatists was considered unnecessarily harsh by the majority of the Christian clergy, possibly because many of them could be accused of being traditores, and a far more lenient course was applied. I don't want to dive too deeply into the minutiae of the arguments, because doctrinal disputes like this quickly turn into black holes of esoteric theology, but suffice it to say that it was a very complex issue. The two sides dug in, and the problem seemed intractable. After an anti-Donatist deacon was elected to serve as the Bishop of Carthage, under highly suspicious circumstances it should be noted, Bishop Donatus of Numidia decided to outflank his enemies in the church and played an unprecedented trump card. He appealed directly to Constantine and asked the emperor to help settle the matter. Now, before we get too far along, I do want to point out that this was not completely uncharted territory. It is often said that the fight over the Donatist heresy and the subsequent Council at Arles was the first time the church invited the emperor in to help solve their problems. But there was too much else going on for me to talk about it at the time. But as Queen Zenobia was extending her influence into Syria, she made common cause with a controversial bishop named Paul of Samosata, who agreed to turn his flock in her direction if she supported his claim to the bishopric of Antioch. Once Palmyra was defeated, a delegation of Christian leaders approached Aurelian and asked him to expel Paul from the city. Since their religious aims coincided with his political aims, Aurelian granted the request and Paul was exiled. That, so far as I can tell, is actually the first time an emperor got in the middle of what was, really, an internal dispute between rival Christian factions. But, that all being said, no emperor had ever gotten involved with doctrinal issues, so Constantine is definitely about to set off into uncharted territory on that front. It should be noted, though, that when Constantine accepted the petition of the Donatists, it was not because he was itching to stick his nose into church business, but because, as emperor, he felt like he had a responsibility to ensure that justice was done. Indeed, the petition delivered to the emperor had nothing to do with doctrinal disputes, but instead focused exclusively on the alleged crimes of the controversial new bishop of Carthage. The Donatist strategy was to smear their rival bishop, get the recent election results tossed out, and then get a new pro-Donatist candidate elected to the bishopric of Carthage. But despite the fact that he agreed, in the interest of justice, that the Donatists should be heard, that did not mean that Constantine was eager to jump into internal church politics with both feet. So he ordered the matter be arbitrated by the Bishop of Rome and a panel of 3 other impartial bishops from Gaul, who would be selected by the emperor personally to ensure a fair result. But before the trial took place, the Bishop of Rome, a staunch anti-Donatist and friend of the accused, packed the judge's table with 15 more bishops, all from Italy and all in his pocket. As soon as the proceedings began, it became clear that the whole thing was now a setup. The council not only ruled against the Donatists on the limited issue of whether the Bishop of Carthage was a guilty man, but they also ruled against them on the broader issue of their doctrinal beliefs, which the council declared heretical. The Donatists were, of course, outraged and appealed to Constantine a second time. When the emperor was filled in on the details of the trial, he agreed that the Donatists had been treated unfairly, and agreed that their case should be retried. This time, before a council composed of bishops from every province in the Western Empire, a council that was to be called by Constantine himself. When the subsequent Council of Arles convened in August of 314, though, the outcome for the Donatists was the same. Their charges against the Bishop of Carthage were tossed out, and their beliefs were declared heretical. The Donatists appealed to Constantine a third time, and like most major court cases, there were a few more procedural twists and turns before the matter was finally settled for good. But in the end, the decision of the Council of Arles stood. The accused bishop was exonerated,